Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, friends and viewers in Germany and Sweden and around the world, a very warm welcome to this event on COP26, which we broadcast live from Glasgow. My name is Per Töresson. I'm the Swedish ambassador to Germany, and it's my great pleasure and honor to open this event, which the embassy has organized together with our partners, the United Nations Association of Germany and the Nordic Council of Ministers. We have chosen to call the event COP26, a milestone for combating climate change, with a question mark. And for sure, days and hours are decisive. The world now expects COP26 to show that we understand what it takes to meet the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree goal, but not least that we are ready to do what is required. Sweden listens to science, and we are certainly ready to take action to meet and to get us back on track. And of course, privileged countries like Sweden and Germany have a special responsibility when it comes to showing the way. And in our experience, engaging all sectors of society is key. And we have, over the last week, seen some promising examples from both industry and finance who are willing to take on the challenge. One very interesting example now takes place in the north of Sweden. The steel industry is one of the largest polluters when it comes to greenhouse emissions. And two Swedish companies now work on what will probably be the largest industrial investment ever in Sweden to reduce CO2 emissions down to zero. Today, they produce 10% of Sweden's emissions, and worldwide we know that the steel industry stands for about 7% of emissions. The first steel has already been delivered, showing that the method works, and the companies aim to put fossil-free steel on the market in a large scale by 2025. And actually, the industry in Sweden doesn't feel threatened by the fact that the transition to fossil-free neutrality is going too fast. It's rather that it's going too slow. Within the initiative Fossil-Free Sweden, 450 actors in 22 different industrial branches have already adopted roadmaps for their contribution to a fossil-free society. You could say that the climate issue has gone from being an environmental issue to being an issue of competitiveness, of exports, and of business policy. Also, the finance sector is a good example. We saw almost 500 important financial actors pledge to place the combat on climate change at the center of the work last week. And thanks to the German State Secretary Jochen Flaschbart's commitment, numerous countries have also committed to increase their contribution to climate funding. Sweden has committed to double its climate funding, and we hope that this will push more countries to assume a greater responsibility. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I really look forward to listening to today's panel discussions with very prominent speakers. But first of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce and to welcome this year's Nobel Prize winner in physics, Professor Klaus Hasselmann. Professor Hasselmann, the screen is yours.
My name is Klaus Hasselmann. As a 90-year-old, I recently received the Nobel Prize in Physics. I was honored for scientific findings I had made more than 40 years ago. With this work, it had become obvious that man-made emissions were responsible for an already observable global warming. Already then, it was clear that further emissions of greenhouse gases would cause even more severe climate change. It had become necessary to act. However, in all these years, CO2 emissions have continued to increase by some 60%. Today, we have multiple scientific evidence that humankind is responsible for global warming that is unprecedented in history. Our knowledge has never been more comprehensive. Unfortunately, our willingness to react has not increased accordingly. We're already in the midst of global warming. We're experiencing multiple consequences of climate change: heat waves, melting of inland glaciers and polar ice caps, rising sea levels, floods, droughts, and loss of biodiversity. Today's challenge is to transform scientific knowledge into political and societal action. This is a task for every individual on Earth, but particularly in the rich part of the world. We are the ones who cause global warming in the first place. We are responsible for the majority of the cumulative CO2 emissions. Secondly, it is a task for politicians. They have to set up rules and regulations to limit greenhouse gas emissions. They have to pave the way for the development of the poorer part of the world without increasing the use of fossil fuels the way the industrial countries have done before. And last but not least, mitigating climate change is a task for scientists. We need to make the causes and consequences of global warming as understandable as possible. We need to describe paths and ways to limit CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050. I hope my younger colleagues will be more successful in communicating their findings than myself. Scientists for future are pointing in the right direction, but we need a much stronger impact on decision makers. The next generation, those who will suffer from the effect of global warming, like Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, have managed to stir up the public and politics much more effectively than we were able to. The longer we wait, the more expensive this necessary transformation will be. In addition, the cost of damage caused by extreme weather conditions, pandemic diseases, or global mass migration will only go with time. We cannot wait.
Good morning to everyone who is joining here at the Nordic Pavilion at COP26, but also good morning to everyone who is joining this event from Germany, Sweden, or elsewhere. My name is Oliver Hasenkamp. I will moderate this event. And I also would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the organizers, the United Nations Association of Germany, and the Swedish Embassy, and express my sincere gratitude to the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Nordic Pavilion who have made this event possible. We cannot wait. That has been the reminder by Klaus Hasselmann to all of us. And that has also been an important message here at COP26 and ahead of the conference. The British presidency has reiterated Paris promised and Glasgow must deliver in order to make sure the Paris Agreement and its target to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius are implemented. In fact, many people say that COP26 is probably the most important international climate change conference since the one in Paris in 2015. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has underlined already in February that COP26 is a critical milestone in our efforts to avert climate catastrophe. So the expectations towards COP26 are very high. But can COP26 meet these expectations? What has been reached so far? What challenges do remain? And is COP26 indeed becoming a milestone for combating climate change, or rather another failed opportunity? These are some of the questions that we would like to discuss with our panel here in Glasgow and additional speakers who join virtually today on the last day of COP26 as the conference draws to an end and as we would like to draw some first conclusions. Unfortunately, Matthias Frumery, who is the Swedish climate change ambassador and chief negotiator, has to leave in a little bit more than 10 minutes to attend an important meeting with his minister. But we are very grateful, Matthias, to have you here at least for another 10 minutes. Thank you for finding your time on this very busy last day of negotiations. So I would like to start with you as the first speaker. Can you summarize for us what has been reached so far? How satisfied are you as a Swedish chief negotiator with the negotiations?
Just say, I think the messages from Ambassador Törresson and the professor were exactly the kind of messages that we have been bringing to the conference, the urgency of climate action, but also the opportunities that we see from a Swedish perspective in climate action. And that's obviously something which we will want to see reflected in the outcomes of the conference. We're now, as you say, at the very last day, and we're seeing texts coming out which will be probably revised during the course of the day. And the meeting we're now attending at 11 o'clock is focusing on finance, which the Swedish minister has been co-facilitating together with his Egyptian colleague. So there was a late night for us yesterday, and we expect there might be a couple of hours left before we can conclude. But I think at this stage, the objectives we came to Glasgow with to ensure that we have a clear path on 1.5, and also that we will be delivering the rule book, as well as coming to conclusions when it comes to climate finance and climate adaptation. On all of those tracks, we see movement, but we still want to push further ahead. So there have been some developments which we think are positive, but we also want to see further action being taken in these last couple of hours. And maybe just as a final introductory point, I think it's worth also recalling, on the one hand, we see the engagement in these various pavilions here, and we have the Business Sweden pavilion with all the Swedish business actors showcasing what Sweden can offer in order to facilitate transition, accelerate transition in other countries. And also the various types of declarations and initiatives which have been launched during the course of these 2 weeks. The number of initiatives at the Leaders Summit, but also, for example, just yesterday, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which was launched together with Sweden as a founding partner. So there have been many good initiatives which we hope to build on in going forward, but we still have a couple of hours left to ensure that we get the best result we can.
Thank you. You already mentioned the Beyond Oil and Gas initiative. Have there been any other initiatives that have been pushed forward, particularly by Sweden, maybe also in cooperation with other European countries at COP26?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have seen our UK hosts arranging a number of various initiatives. For example, the Glasgow Breakthroughs, which were announced last week, which have 4 different tracks where we're wanting to collaborate between both business and the public sector. For example, in accelerating the transition when it comes to fossil-free steel, which the ambassador mentioned is sort of one of the examples which we want to bring from a Swedish perspective. But there have also been initiatives when it comes to phasing out the financing of fossil fuels, where we have been part of those kind of conversations as well.
I know that Germany committed to not start any further fossil fuel subsidies from next year onwards. Has Sweden also made such a commitment already, or is something planned in near future?
It was made previously, so
okay.
We were a bit ahead of Germany there, but we're happy to see that Germany is joining that kind of movement as well.
All right. You already mentioned that there are still a couple of issues left that are on the negotiation agenda today. If you're quite honest, do you believe we will have an outcome today, or do the negotiations maybe continue through the whole night and even tomorrow?
Well, let's say that Friday is a long day at the second week of the COP, so we will reach conclusions today.
All right. What would you say are the most challenging issues that remain, and what could be possible ways out of the deadlock on these issues?
Well, I think what we want to see as an outcome is an ambitious rule book, and we still have work to do both when it comes to Article 6 and the transparency framework, but also when it comes to common time frame. So there are a number of issues still open, and also when it comes to the so-called cover decision, which is sort of setting the path towards 1.5. We would have wanted to see an even more ambitious approach in the cover decision, but we hope to be working together with partners to ensure that during the course of the day.
Right. Do you have time for one last question?
One.
All right. Then before we are coming back, of course, to the agenda items and the possible outcomes of COP26 later on in the discussion, I would at least briefly talk with you about the process of negotiations. As this COP is taking place during a global pandemic, the British presidency still has reiterated they want to make it an inclusive COP. What is your impression of the representation also of people from different places in the world? Is it an inclusive COP, or are there some challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic in this regards?
At least from our perspective, I would say that we appreciate very much the efforts of the UK presidency to secure an inclusive conference, both in terms of parties' participation, but also when it comes to civil society actors. Having said that, we do recognize that there have been challenges, especially during the first few days of the conference, both in terms of access and also the virtual platform which has been established for the conference. But then again, just having the virtual platform in itself, I think, is a huge step forward, and hopefully something we can build on for future conferences. Because as I think this is the first time we've actually used that mode of work, which in the going forward could be create possibilities for an even more inclusive process for various types of actors to engage in the negotiations.
All right. Thank you, Matthias. Thanks for joining us on this very busy last day of negotiation, and good luck with the negotiations, and good luck with making COP26 actually a milestone for combating climate change.
Thanks very much. We need it.
I now would like to introduce you to our next speaker. I would now like to introduce you to Professor Johan Rockstrom. He is the co-director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and one of the leading experts on climate change, international climate change negotiations. And he has been attending COP26 during the first week of negotiations last week, and is now joining this event virtually. We are very glad for having you here at this event today, Professor Rockstrom. Can you give us a short overview about the status of negotiations from your perspective? What has been reached at COP26 so far, and where do we stand in the negotiations?
Yeah, thanks, and great to be with you. And actually, my statement in a way comes, not surprisingly, as a bridge between Klaus Hasselmann and what we just heard from Matthias Frumeri, because no doubt have we made progress at COP26. I would even argue that COP26 is a milestone, that we have turned a corner. We're no longer arguing of the direction of travel. We're arguing and debating the speed of change. So all the countries in the world are swimming along the same lane, which has never happened before in COP history. But Klaus Hasselmann has the scientific assessment correct, of course, that the only reason why we cannot lean back and declare COP26 a success is because of the urgency, because we have only 10 years left of the global carbon budget, because we need all the countries now to join. So it doesn't matter that we have the BOGA launch yesterday with some 30 countries. It doesn't matter that we have 100 countries signing on to the methane reduction pledge of 30% by 2030 with US and the EU as initiators. It doesn't add up to have over 100 countries pledging to reverse deforestation by 2030. And it's not even enough that Mark Carney was able to drum up 130 trillion US dollars in the massive alignments of financial assets. Even though this is unprecedented in COP history, it doesn't add up because we do not have China, we do not have US on board on all the coal phase out. We don't have the big players adding up to the 1.5 degrees Celsius planetary boundary that we've all agreed upon. So that's the drama, that we are making progress, but it's insufficient. And you know that when you add things up today, we came to Glasgow with a 2.7 trajectory, meaning we were heading towards catastrophe. We have, with the pledges that were on the table, kind of brought that down to 2.4. And if you add in the net zero promises, basically India stepping on board, the US, China, the European Union, with net zero pathways, it could give us a 50% chance of holding 1.8 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. But it would require everyone to do what they've promised. It would require no tipping points, no surprises from any of the non-CO2 gas emission pathways. They have to follow the same reduction pathways. So it's a lot of assumptions there. But I would argue that should be remembered. It's a signal that when you get political agreements, when you get commitments scientifically aligned with net zero pathways, it does change the trajectory. Every 10th of degree matters, and we're able to push it down. So I wouldn't declare Glasgow a success, but I wouldn't declare Glasgow a failure either. It's this mixed picture, and therefore I very much agree with the Klaus Matthias kind of integrated communication here as a starter.
Thank you very much, Professor Rockstrom, for these introductory remarks, and we will come back to several of the issues you already mentioned, including the role of the US and China, for example. I now would like to introduce Jule Zentek. She's a young journalist from Germany who is working for the Westdeutscher Rundfunk as one of the producers or presenters of the Instagram channel Klimaneutral. And she has been participating here at COP26 in a youth media workshop hosted by the United Nations Association of Germany. Jule, participating as a young journalist here at COP26, also your first COP, what is your impression of the atmosphere here at COP26 when you're walking around talking to young people, to people from civil society? What's the atmosphere there? How are their feelings about the debate?
First of all, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm here in Glasgow since Monday, and I was lucky to meet a lot of different people, a lot of different young people, and all of them were really excited about about the people they could meet here. Me too. I'm really impressed by all the things that happen here, by all the people who get together and talk about this really important issue we are dealing with. And I also felt that most of them are really looking forward to what will be decided today or maybe tomorrow. A lot of them really want to see that we are going straight on the path to 1.5, and a lot of them are also disappointed, and yeah, because they see that it is not done enough until now. And I think they are really, on the one side, they are really happy to be here, to get this experience and to be able to participate and meet other people and get to know their story about climate crisis in their country, maybe, me too, at least. And I think they are all waiting for the results today, and I'm really excited how they will feel in the end.
Thank you, Jule. We already talked to Matthias Frömery, the Swedish chief negotiator, in the beginning of this event. So I'm really happy that we also have someone from the German side. I'm really glad that we have Carsten Sach with us today. He's Director General at the German Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, and one of Germany's key negotiators on climate change for many years. Unfortunately, he has not been able to attend COP26 in person this year, but we are really glad that you are joining this event virtually, Mr. Sach. What is the German perspective on COP26 and what has been reached so far, Mr. Sach? How satisfied are you and is Germany with the progress that has been made at COP26?
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you. And it comes not as a surprise that I'm very close to what Matthias said, because we're negotiating as the EU, but also what Klaus and Johan putting forward is, of course, part of the picture. I'm so far quite optimistic. It is clear that Glasgow has provided already now significant progress. We saw a clear signal not just on negotiations, but also on implementation. We saw that India, for example, for the first time ever committed to greenhouse gas neutrality. We saw all the initiatives already mentioned, just the Glasgow breakthroughs, cooperation to reaching solutions to tackle the gap, which Johan was rightly pointing out on greenhouse gas, neutral energy, transport, hydrogen and steel. We have the leaders' declaration on forest and land use, and a pledge of 12 billion supporting that. With the coal phase out, we have the global methane pledge, etc. I think that was good by the British presidency that they orchestrated this, because it was creating momentum the first week of the conference. Now, of course, Matthias was pointing that out, we are in the end game, and it's important what we will see in the so-called cover decisions, which are the political essence of what Glasgow is, and in some decisions on the rulebook. So, reflecting on what Johan said, what we need to be reflected in the cover decision is a clear pathway for accelerated mitigation, ambition, and implementation. We know that the next year is critical. One important milestone has already been mentioned by Johan, clear reference to the 1.5 degrees, which is new. But what we see a gap between long-term promises and 2030 NDCs. And so what we need is a clear and structured process and urging of countries to revisit their NDCs to become better over the next year. I think that is important, that should be in the cover decision. Also, we need strengthened support for developing countries struggling with climate issues. So that means more adaptation finance. In the most recent text, we see a doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, which I think is a very positive movement forward. We see movement also on loss and damage, probably strengthening through some kind of facility, the so-called Santiago network, to getting this important issue more prominence, and fiscal backing. I think that is important. I think we need to secure environmental integrity. That means no double counting, no carryover of Kyoto credits when we're defining the Paris mechanisms. And last but not least, I would mention transparency. Transparency is important to compare just the efforts of different countries. And it's important for civil society and for the media to see what's really going on. And so far, yesterday, one big oil exporting country was shy in opening up their data on oil exports of their companies. And they say that's it's a secret of the companies. So, but if we were to allow that, I think the peer pressure, which COPs and youth civil society, the Fridays for Future are delivering as an important part, would not be successful. So overall, I think we're moving in the right direction. I'm hopeful that the final outcome in the cover decisions and in the rulebook will be okay. It's not perfect, but I think it's progress.
Thank you, Carsten Sach. We have also with us today Fredrika Andersson. She's a Swedish youth representative here at COP26. And I would like to ask you whether you share these rather optimistic views on the progress that have been made, or whether you maybe see the negotiations so far a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more critical, like, for example, the Fridays for Future movement is doing, that is having many demonstrations here in Glasgow, but also at COP26.
Thank you so much for having me here. Well, basically, I would say that it is too early to say in many cases what the outcome would be, but the clear message and the clear ambition for this COP was to keep 1.5 alive. That was like the headline. And what we're seeing now is, well, that 1.5 is in need of acute life-supporting aid, I would say, to be kept alive. We are seeing steps in the right directions, but they're tiny steps. And as Johan Rockstrom mentioned, what we need to do is to put up the speed to implement this much faster. And I think the youth has been very clear with our demands about this for 26 COPs right now. I'm 25, so for longer than my my time here on Earth. We've been saying you need to de-invest from fossil fuels now, and you need to cut emissions. And we're still not seeing that. So I think that those expectations are not going to be met. And also that youth on the streets have high expectations on COP than the COP could ever deliver. Because what youth is saying is that we need a system change, we need to change our relations to nature. And those are not agenda points. Those are not something that the ministers are actually talking about. We can hear that the discussion is going forward. We are starting to mention fossil fuels. We're starting to include youth in the texts that are being negotiated. But I think there's something that we all need to take back when we go back from Glasgow and continue to keep that pressure up with our politicians, the ones that we've elected in our countries, because that is on the national level that we can actually do that change that is needed to keep 1.5 alive for real.
Thank you. Greta Thunberg even called COP26 a PR event where leaders are rather looking for loopholes than for action. Would you agree with this very pessimistic view on the conference and the atmosphere here?
I've been asked this a lot. I can start by saying I really understand Greta's frustration and that she's tired because she's been playing nicely and saying those recommendations for many years now and nothing has happened. Emissions continue to increase. So yes, until we actually see the curves pointing downwards, then the COP would be for nothing. I think we need to see that in a longer perspective, looking back. Was this the turning point? But I do believe that having all these ministers and all these also these activists and this meeting place for the whole world basically really makes a difference. It is a extremely flawed process, the UNFCCC and the COP26. It's exclusive in many ways and it's complicated and not enough, but it's also our best chance. It is what we have and it does move us in the right direction, though too slow.
Thank you. Several speakers already mentioned some of the outcomes or possible outcomes here at COP26, and I now would like to look a little bit more on detail on some of these issues, including the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and land use. And I would like to ask you, Mr. Rockstrom, can you briefly explain to our audience what exactly is this Leaders Declaration, and from a scientific perspective, will it be helpful to reach the 1.5 degree target?
Yeah, thanks. No, it is a significant declaration. The question, of course, is to implement it. I mean, I totally agree with Fredrika and support so strongly the whole Fridays for Future movement, holding the world, the adults in the world accountable. And I would actually say that one quite interesting, let's say, feature of COP26 is that not only do we have multiple pledges and promises, they're all quantified. And that goes also with the deforestation pledge. These are, I mean, we could potentially land in the conclusion that these are greenwashing, hand-wavy initiatives or promises, but that cannot be judged in Glasgow, because in Glasgow, the purpose is not to solve the climate crisis. The purpose in Glasgow is, just like Fredrika says, to keep the 1.5 alive by putting forward the science-based plans, and Glasgow is about setting the plans. And one part of that plan is to keep nature, climate stocks and flows intact. And we know that 56% of our greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel emissions have been taken up in intact ecosystems, in marine systems and on land. And land is roughly 25%. So this is the world's largest subsidy to the world economy. It is what has held us away from 1.5 so far. So that's the medicine in this intensive care unit, is actually a healthy nature. We just published a paper before Glasgow showing that if we had not had the carbon sinks in terrestrial ecosystems in forest on land, we would have already have crashed through 1.5. Now this pledge for halting deforestation latest by 2030 is signed by over 100 countries. It includes Brazil, so you have the Amazon there. Can we trust this? Big question mark. But if this would be implemented, it would be a significant piece of the puzzle to be able to hold well below 2, aiming for 1.5. However, There's one big, however, issue here, that if you look at the IPCC's over 100 modeling runs, that lands at 1.5 and gives us a remaining global carbon budget of some 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is the net zero pathways to have a safe landing of fossil fuel emission phase out. These models already factor in the assumption that forests will continue sequestering carbon. So you cannot do what I've seen during last week in Glasgow, the mistake of simply saying, fantastic, we now have this deforestation pledge. It translates to some 5, 6, 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide potential of carbon sequestration in intact forests that we're now afforesting. And that means that we are coming a significant way towards cutting emissions by half to 2030. That's of course not possible to do because you cannot mix these two. The climate models have already factored in healthy forests. So you need this pledge, you need it delivered, but it's something that is additional to phasing out fossil fuels. You cannot mix the two.
Thank you, Mr. Rockstrom. You lined out that everything is quite connected, and it's always important to also look behind maybe what's obvious at the first glance. When we are talking about deforestation, basically the main process on this is actually not happening here at COP26 on climate change, but there's a separate biodiversity, so-called biodiversity COP, which started in October virtually and will be continued next year in Kunming in China. Would you say that for climate activists, also climate scientists, maybe also climate negotiators, it becomes more important in future to not only focus on the climate change conferences every year, but to endeavor the interlinkages that are in existence to other United Nations processes, like the International Biodiversity Convention, for example.
Yeah, well, you know, our failure to halt rapidly confronting global climate disaster, we're following a pathway that would take us to a disaster point, is about our failure to phase out fossil fuels. But you know, it will come as no surprise to anyone on this meeting that that is not the determining factor. The final battleground, whether we will fail or succeed with landing at a manageable level of global warming, is not whether we are able to phase out fossil fuels or not, is whether we're able to keep the nature carbon sinks intact. That's where the big decisive point is. The moment we lose the carbon sinks in the ocean and on all the critical biomes on land, that's when we start having really big difficulties, because these carbon feedbacks from permafrost thawing, from soils, from temperate forests, from rainforests, would put us in a trajectory far away from 1.5. So yes, you're absolutely right. We need a full integration of nature and climate. That, I would argue, COP26 has been a significant step forward, a very significant step forward even. I mean, the UK government should be congratulated for that. We need that integration with the Kunming CBD process, the COP15 and the COP26 process. We're seeing that happening. We're seeing more science-aligned quantifications, actually. As you may have seen, there is a nature positive agenda arising, which is quantifications to have an equivalent of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit for nature, zero loss of nature from 2020 onwards. So I think this is something where I hope we will see much more progress. But again, it's important to be careful with how we count.
Thank you, Mr. Rockström. Fredrika, you would like to add something on this issue?
No, I want to echo Johan as well in many cases, and I just want to add that I think we cannot see climate and biodiversity as separate issues, and I think youth and the youth movement is very clear on this. We can see both that is connected, climate, biodiversity, but also human rights and indigenous rights, and it all comes down to what is our relation with nature. Do we see ourselves as part of nature, or is nature something separate for us that we need to save? And concerning this global pledge, I know that women in the Swedish youth movement are very critical, since it wouldn't change the way the Sweden is doing forestry. It is a pledge that you will continue, preserving forest, but the Swedish type of forestry would still be the same, which has been very criticized by the youth movement, both for biodiversity loss, but also for the rights of the Sami people in Sweden. So I think it is also sometimes dangerous when we package this as such a silver bullet, something that would solve so much, when it might just be putting like a stamp on the status quo.
Thank you, Frederica. I now would like to turn to you, Carsten Zach, again. First of all, do you would like to add something on what has been already said? Then please go ahead, and then I will follow with another question to you.
I fully agree what Johan and Federica said. Just two small additions. Johan is absolutely right that the UK presidency has made huge progress in combining the different issues and integrating them. But we were still and are still disappointed on how that is reflected in the cover decisions so far. Yes, we see the movement toward nature positive targets and an agenda. Johan is right, but not everybody agrees on that one yet. And therefore, this is certainly a point which we need to see strengthened in the cover decisions. And Sweden and Germany just were always fighting for that. And I'm proud that we are, when I personally was very much behind the predecessor of the Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Landscapes, together with Norway and the UK, and developing it here as well. The second one, what is new in this new declaration on forests and land use? Johan mentioned Brazil, who was missing in 2014, and there's a question mark, I agree, but China is on board here as well. I'm telling that because protecting forest and biodiversity is not just an obligation of those countries who are hosting most of the biodiversity. It is a big issue for us and China and all the markets in which the products which just damage diversity are marketed are in. So therefore, I think the aspect of supply chains, deforestation, free and biodiversity protecting supply chain is critical, and that has a lot of prominence in this declaration. But here it goes the same, what Johan said for Brazil, implementation is key, and vigilant eyes of civil societies that we are all following this up is most important.
Thank you, Mr. Zach. I would like to also look little bit on the pledges that have been made to end coal and other fossil fuel subsidies. Germany has committed to do so from next year, or at least to not start any new subsidies from next year. We've already heard from Matthias Frömery that Sweden committed something similar already some years ago. My question to you would be, why is that only happening now? Why has this decision, these pledges, not made many, many years or even decades earlier? Because the science is clear for a long time that fossil fuels are actually the cornerstone of climate change. So why is it only happening now? What is the political process behind this issue? And also, how exactly will Germany deal with, from your perspective, fossil fuel subsidies that are already in place?
First, I'm very happy that we did join, and you might imagine that we from the Environment Ministry were fighting for that for years. And I think it is most important. Probably our situation was a little bit different than Sweden. Sweden has much more natural renewable energy sources and has made other decisions on energy policy, while Germany was dependent on lignite and hard coal. And that was a legacy, and you're well aware that we did a huge negotiation process with the regions which do the coal mining and came up with the end date for coal. That was too late. Yes, everybody is right. My hopes are with the new coalition forming in Germany which wants to move forward the coal ending date. I'm personally convinced that through higher prices in the EU ETS, it will be phased out earlier anyhow, but politically it's important to capture that signal as well. When it comes down to subsidies, the declaration says no subsidies for international coal in future, nothing for the future, but there's still some embedded. I'm pretty satisfied that cutting fossil fuel subsidies in our domestic system is one of the priorities within the new government to be built. And therefore, we hope that we can do that, because the meat is in scrapping such kind of subsidies at home. It's pretty easy to doing that abroad, and you saw that China was doing so, and which is huge progress, but still they're a little bit shy to be too concrete at the national front. We are pretty much further there, but we are not there yet. But I think it is something which I see probably be solved in the next 1 or 2 years to become.
Thank you. Carsten Sach, you mentioned that there have been elections in Germany, and there's currently a caretaker government. Can you very briefly, before I then come back with questions to other panelists as well, tell us how that has impacted Germany in the negotiations? Would the German position have been stronger if there were more clarity about who will be? I mean, of course, we know basically who will be the next government, but it's not in place yet. So how has this situation in Germany affected the negotiations?
I think that's a myth. It didn't impact our position. I think we had a strong position because on international climate change, we have a unified position of all democratic parties. Where parties differ is on speed and certain instruments we use at home. And that, you're absolutely right, is important, how the coalition treaty will look like and what we will be able to be doing in the next 2 years. But on international climate change, I have been serving under green, red, and black ministers and with different chancellors, and climate change was always top of the agenda. I think Germany, like Sweden and the UK, has always been at the forefront. I think when at the national agenda, you can argue that we have seen significant differences.
Thank you, Carsten Sach. Jule, when you're speaking with young people in Germany, what do you think are the main expectations of young people on the issue of climate change? The key top priorities they would expect from a future German government, but of course also from other governments in other places of the world, to be implemented as soon as possible?
As I'm coming from the western of Germany, where we have many coal mining companies and coal mines, there are a lot of protests against the coal companies right there, and of course Fridays for Future is always protesting against the destroyment of the villages right there. And I think this is one of the main points the youth is protesting for. Of course, they want political decisions that we will really reach 1.5, but especially in Western Germany, the youth really wants to stop these coal companies to going on like usual. And for example, last week we have a new minister in North Rhine-Westphalia as well. And in his first speech, he represented himself as the new climate protection minister. And he also announced that he will try everything to phase out coal before 2030 in North Rhine-Westphalia. And that was really big news. And for example, Fridays for Future also said that this was because we put so much pressure on the politic. And of course, we will now see if he really will phase out coal next year are new elections. And we will see if he can go on with his plan. But I think especially phasing out the fossil fuels is also one of the main issues young people see and young people want to see a change in.
Thank you. Jule, Frederica, the action on climate change is usually taking place not on the international level, but just as we have heard, rather on local or regional, maybe national level. All the decisions made here have to be implemented on several different levels. So from your perspective, what is actually the deal of having this international conference? Why is it important nonetheless to have this international conference to come to these conclusions, even though they are all far too often not implemented on national level?
I think there's various really good reasons to be here in Glasgow. I think one of them, or the ideal Glasgow and the ideal COP, is a place where we meet the ones most affected to climate change. Because if we only take decisions with our own colleagues, our own inhabitants in regard, then we would miss the goal by far. And we wouldn't be doing a just transition and action for climate justice. So I think that is what COP should be about, hearing those who are affected by climate change right now, not in 2030 and 2050, but they're actually suffering the effects right in this moment in one way. And I also think that it is easy on the national level to point fingers to other countries saying, okay, why should Sweden reduce its emissions when that country or that country hasn't reduced their emissions? So I therefore think it's extremely important to meet at this global level and feel that joint responsibility that we all have, that every country needs to do their part according to their circumstances. And Sweden and Germany has a large historical depth of using fossil fuels in creating this crisis. So I think that reminder is really important to bring to the national level and the policies that politicians put forward.
Thank you. Frederica, we have already discussed about some progress that have been made here at COP26, and most of it is actually separate declarations by leaders or pledges by certain countries, but not really content of the cover text, and we will come to that in a minute. But first of all, I would like to ask you, Mr. Rockstrom, whether you regard this as a kind of a problematic trend, that there is more and more focus from COP to COP on certain countries going ahead instead of having real multilateral agreements that include all the countries. Do you think this is somewhat problematic and there should be more energy spent to convince all countries going in the same direction, or is it just pragmatic and it's better to have certain countries doing pledges than reaching nothing in the end when we need consensus?
Yeah, look here. I mean, if you ask me purely as an academic, as a scientist, I would actually be honest with you and say that I look nostalgically back on the Kyoto Protocol from COP3 in 1997, with Annex 1 countries having, legally bound percentages that needed to be monitored, verified, and reported upon, with very clear, legally bound targets for emission reductions. Of course, that would have been the easiest and most efficient way to get the whole world to simply solve this crisis once and for all. However, that does not translate to reality in the world. And we've come to realize that this hybrid model with a legally binding agreement at the top, because actually staying well below 2, aiming for 1.5 is legally bound. All countries have signed on to it. Actually, even the NDCs are legally bound. Every country is obliged to have a nationally determined contribution. The only voluntary thing in the Paris Agreement is how you develop the content in your plan. So there is this hybrid voluntarism, and that has been shown to be a necessity. Now, I think we have much empirical evidence that we can work in that reality. And we have more and more empirical evidence also showing that alliances, large enough alliances for change, can tip over the logic even for the majorities. And this is not only in climate. We see that basically in all S curves of innovation. It isn't so that everyone agrees with awareness and knowledge and financial capacities to step out of passive smoking or step out of apartheid or step into mobile phone digital era. It is when you have innovators, alliances, large enough minorities that tip over the logic. Why? Because they show that the new pathway is more attractive. And that is what is so unique with the climate agenda today, that not only do we have a science-based high risk that we need to kind of move away from, we also have so much evidence, I mean, I would call it even unequivocal evidence, that the zero carbon future can give massive win-win outcomes in terms of economy, security, health, all the attributes that normally are so important for any nation's future. So yes, I would support what we're seeing in terms of alliances. The problem is that we have so little time. I come back to Klaus Hasselmann, that you cannot lose the three largest emitters along the way: China, the US, and India. You kind of need the big players on board to make such alliances really deliver, because we have so little time. But yes, I think we can play within that hybrid. It becomes messier, but it's actually something that shows some. And just to close, the current trajectory in the car industry in the world, the current trajectory in the heavy truck industry in the world is proving this. Actually, you have large enough industries moving ahead and creating a new logic, a new trajectory, a new attractor.
Thank you. Mr. Rockstrom, you have mentioned the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that are set by each and every country to outline what they will do on national level to reduce CO2 emissions and contribute to reaching the 1.5 degree and 2 degree targets of the Paris Agreement. And as we've heard before, the current cover draft once again underlines especially the 1.5 degree target. These NDCs have to be updated after, I think, 5 years by each and every country. And at this COP, there's a lot of discussion about whether countries that do not provide an updated NDC, or only an updated NDC that from a scientific perspective is not sufficient to contribute to reaching 1.5 degree, are obliged to come back the following year to present another updated NDC. Carsten Sach, what would be the German perspective on this?
I think Johan described beautifully of how the hybrid system does work. And I mentioned the point you're asking about in my introductory remarks. I think it's not an obligation. The obligation is to come back every 5 years. That's what Paris says. And we are fighting for common timeframes in order to make these NDCs better comparable. But what I would like to see, and we, the EU, would like to see, is that countries are invited and urged to come back earlier due to the speed we need to solve the climate crisis. And there is a moderate wording in the current draft, which I find important. That also needs to be complemented by another hybrid element. For example, ministerial roundtables, a clear process, yearly reports from the Secretariat comparing where do we stand now. But that is not the legally binding part, but it's the political part where those who think they want to be in line with the 1.5 targets come forward, and therefore creating speed. That we have lost the world, and Johan, as you know, the same feelings for Kyoto, because I was just very much involved in all that. But a strict regime with only 10% of the emissions doesn't work. So, and COPs, I think it's very good that we are moving more into implementation. And for me, a COP has 4 different functions. The first one is being the stage for alliances backed by their leaders, because integration into all policies in countries is key. So the leaders element. The second one is shaping global rules, and it's the elements which we call rulebook here. The third one is it's some kind of a global exposition for solutions. So it's spreading the event. And the fourth element, I think Federica already said, it is a stage for climate justice, it is a stage for vulnerable countries. Because if it were only the bigs just having or putting forward a solutions framework, we would lose the poor and the vulnerables, and therefore, for equity reasons, these COPs are central.
Thank you, Mr. Zach. You again mentioned a few issues I would like to come to in a moment, including the representation, especially from people from the Global South. But first of all, I would briefly look on some issues that have not been discussed so much in detail yet, where we still have challenges in the negotiations. We already had several references to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the last article that needs to be discussed to finalize the so-called Paris Rulebook. Johan Rockstrom, can you briefly explain to our audience that is maybe not used so much to the details of the Paris Agreement? What exactly are the challenges with Article 6? What exactly is the reason why we haven't finalized the Paris Rulebook for Article 6 yet?
Well, there are many pieces to this, but at the highest level, Article 6 is really about how do we account carbon across national borders. So countries like Germany and Sweden have set out net zero pathways, and the net which we have come to accept is necessary is allowing for investments in carbon reductions abroad, which is a way of trying to compensate down difficult to abate sectors, for example. But it's also a way of trying to connect different carbon markets around the world. And one of the nuts that we are struggling with is this question of if Germany buys carbon sequestration technology, even like direct air capture or CCS technology in India, for example, is Germany allowed to account for those emission reductions, which Germany would like to be able to do, of course, to reach net zero? Or is India able to account for them on their side because they have actually thereby reduced their emissions? And how do we avoid the double counting? So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle here. So it's really about the carbon accounting. And I would like to add that Article 6 is also, I believe, what will be opening up for more carbon pricing across different markets, because we need to have a leveling playing field across trading between countries. And for example, the European Union now, with the ETS price, the emission trading scheme price, moving rapidly upwards and now having been beyond 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, which is incredibly positive. Finally, the emission trading scheme is starting to bite and work. Well, but that can only operate very short term because, very rapidly, countries that trade with the European Union will have to have some form of leveling off system so that you have fair, competitive trading on the market across all sectors. So this is quite an acute issue of how do we handle this interrelationship between countries, economic policy on pricing as well.
Thank you, Mr. Rockstrom. Carsten Zach, do you believe that we will finally be able at COP26 to finalize the Paris Rulebook, or will it need one or even more COPs to find common sense on what has been just described by Johan Rockstrom?
I think it's too early to call. As you rightly said, Article 6 discussions are going on just this minute, but I'm optimistic that we will be finalizing it here. Next to the point that we need to ensure that there is no double counting, as Johan said, there's another issue which is closely linked to ambition. Some countries are pressing for carrying over old units produced under the Kyoto Protocol into this new legal framework, which would effectively diminish the ambition level which we have in the Paris Agreement right now. And therefore we need probably to do some compromises, but we need to limit it to a very small amount. I think that's the most important. And of course, there will be always future detail of reviews and fine-tuning the transparency regime, but overall, I think we need to do that. I think there is probably a slight difference on what, to Johan, on whether Article 6 can really deliver on what is important, which is protecting those countries and regions like the EU in also creating a level playing field. I think I agree with what Johan said, that we need a much more broad and unified carbon price throughout the world, but probably here leadership coalitions will be the path for developing into that direction. Article 6 probably will be a little bit too complex way to moving that forward. Finally, it could move into Article 6, but here I think I would also argue for a hybrid approach between major trading partners first, and with the openness to including also smaller developing countries.
Thank you. Frederica, another issue that is very high on the agenda here at COP26 is climate finance. And a few days ago I heard a delegate saying that it is over-promised for many years, but absolutely under-delivered. I don't think I have to ask you whether you agree, but my question to you would rather be, what would be your perspective as a young person? What do you also expect maybe of Sweden, your own country, but also of other industrialized countries like Germany, to provide more funding themselves, maybe, but to push other countries in delivering what they have promised?
No, I think that's absolutely crucial, and it's one of the red lines that we as the Swedish youth has put forward to our negotiation. Or to our delegation, that we need to meet the 100 billion goal yesterday or a couple of years ago. We should be have a clear action path on how it will be met and overcompensated for that lack of time. But I think another really important issue, and something that we hear from our global colleagues, they are in the global youth movement, is the finance to loss and damage. Once those losses and damage that we can't adapt to, that will occur due to the climate crisis. And there we've seen interesting initiatives here, such as the Climate Justice Fund from Scotland. And I think the European Union has a lot to step up there in how much we actually compensate those who are worst affected by the climate crisis, since we are the ones who've built our own welfare on fossil fuels and creation of this crisis.
Thank you, Frederica. Loss and damage is in fact one of the most difficult issues in the negotiations, as it also includes the question of compensation of countries hit by climate change, particularly hard by polluter states, including Germany and Sweden, for example. Carsten Sach, what is the German position on loss and damage, and how do you regard the small, tiny progress that have been reached here at COP26 that just have been mentioned by Frederica, since some countries started to pledge some money for a loss and damage fund?
I think that we have seen significant progress. It is the question of compensation, as you know, is explicitly out of the realm of the Paris Agreement, because that's a difficult legal question where some countries have difficulties, not only developed countries but also developing countries, But having said that, I think the concept of loss and damage needs to be operationalized. There is a so-called Santiago network on loss and damage, and it seems that we're moving towards the direction that there will be funding for this network to move forward. On the question of what are the ultimate solutions, we actually are spending each and every year more than hundreds of millions of dollars through helping countries in having insurance against loss and damage. So that's a hybrid approach between private sector approaches, where countries also pay a part on their own in order to really do the best to prevent such kind of loss and damage, but also in case loss and damage occurs, they will have compensation from an insurance scheme. And the trick is that rich countries are helping to pay parts of the premium in order to establish these systems. So loss and damage is an issue which we cannot solve alone under UNFCCC, but we need to include humanitarian organizations, and we need to involve the private sector, particularly the insurance sector as well. But in the end, I agree with the question. There is a part where we need to do more as the donor countries as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Zach. Just one follow-up question, and I would like to ask you for a quick answer. But that means that there's no willingness from German side to accept any compensation payments that are called for example, by small island countries or least developed countries. Is that correct?
I think compensation is not an issue which is covered by the Paris Agreement. That's questions of which probably will be further developed in courts. There are lots of lawsuits in this respect. There are issues still of causation to be solved, and we are proud that we are at the forefront of moving the international cooperation agenda forward. But I think it would not be useful to having these legal terms like compensation or liability included on that question, because it's explicitly out of this legal framework.
Thank you, Mr. Zach. When we are talking about loss and damage, we are speaking especially about the needs and concerns of least developed countries, small island developing countries, low-lying coastal states, which brings me back to one issue we had already in the beginning of this debate, touched very briefly upon, namely the inclusiveness and representation of delegates, also young people, people from civil society, from media, from those countries here at the climate change conference. Jule, what is your impression when you're walking around COP? Do you see a fair representation from people from countries that are particularly affected by climate change? Also, when you're in the media center here at COP26, do you see there are a lot of media from the global south, or have they been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in attending COP26?
Actually, when in my first time on Monday entered the media center, I was a bit shocked because everyone really was white, and there were some people who were black, that's true, but I think there were especially white journalists from around the world, but they were right. And in the next days, I was able to meet a lot of young people. There were amazing people who came from Brazil, who came from Indonesia, but everyone was telling me it was so hard to get here, and everyone told me they all of them know someone who could not come to Glasgow, and because of the restrictions, because of COVID-19, because of the quarantine rules, because they are not able to pay this amount of money for hotels, for flights, and I think especially those people who are not here, they cannot make clear what is actually happening in their home countries, how they are already affected by climate change, and they cannot represent their needs and what they need now, and a lot of them really have the fear that they are forgotten, and I think it's of course one task of me as a journalist to also represent those people who are not here, but it's really hard, and I think it also it also shows that maybe the whole COP is some kind of distorted, and also the negotiations, of course, because some of them or some of the delegations who cannot be here cannot attend in person and cannot be cannot present themselves as powerful as they could be if they would be here. And I really think that's one of the biggest issues we have at this COP.
Thank you, Jule. Frederica, would you like to add?
No, I think Jule is completely right in everything that you've said. There's so many structural barriers for the ones most affected by the climate crisis to actually be here. And I think civil society's frustration is the ambition that the UK government had of having the most inclusive COP ever in the times of a pandemic with all these barriers. And I know that UK have done a lot to try to overcome that, but we still saw many problems, especially in the first 2 days with inclusion. We still, if we look around, we see this is not an equal representation of the world, and the COP wouldn't be inclusive as a definition until those we see around here would be like a picture of the inhabitants of the world, or even more representation to the ones most affected. And something that the civil society is especially like alarmed about is the number of fossil fuel lobbyists being here. So this number saying that if everybody who represented fossil fuel industry would be at one delegation, then that would be the largest delegation, bigger than any of the other countries, and it would be larger than many of the most affected countries' delegations combined. So I think we have a lot to deal with in that aspect, to making those that needs to be in the center of these discussions, those most affected actually being able to be here.
Thank you, Frederica. You're Swedish youth representative here at COP26. Can you share with us whether you are in contact with other young people who have similar roles for their countries, and maybe also very briefly line out what is your link to the official Swedish delegation, and whether maybe more countries should implement such programs?
Yes, so I am one of 2 Swedish youth representatives within the SHARP negotiation delegation, which is not something that every country has. So what we do is that we try to collect the views of Swedish youth, we bring them forward into the delegation, we take part in all the delegation meetings, and can say this is the views of youth, and being there in those critical situations, in those closed rooms many times where compromises have to be made, and being sure that we are there as a watchdog or as a witness to the decisions being made, and being able to highlight what youth really needs to be decided. And many other countries have similar systems. Some are more progressive than Sweden, and many are less progressive than Sweden. But something that I think is especially clear and perhaps alarming here is that Germany doesn't have any youth representatives. And I would say, the Swedish delegation hasn't fallen apart since we've been included since 2015. So I would rather say that it's about time for every other country to do the same, because decisions about us can't be without us.
We can give this question directly to you, Carsten Sach. I mean, probably you're not the one deciding about it, but could it be possible that Germany also takes 1 or 2 youth representatives to future COPs?
We have not done so in the past, and still I need to be convinced that is the right thing. But before I put forward the reasons for that, yes, all what has been said of more equal representation from the global south, from poor people, from the youth, I would subscribe to that. We had a debate also with the Fridays for Future movement, and I personally had it, and with youth delegates. So we have quite many German youth delegates in there, but if they are part of the delegation, the same goes for scientists and for green industrialists, etc. They're part of the delegation discipline. It's an international negotiation process, and so far we have convinced our partners, including from the youth, that they are more powerful if they're outside the delegation. And we offer briefings, but so that they are informed, but they're not part of our negotiation team. I think we have made good experience, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to include youth in the conferences, just the opposite. And therefore, that's the way we have chosen. And I think it's one which gave us a very trustworthy relationship with the youth movement in Germany. And my telephone was always open and for daily briefings so that they are informed. That's our way. I praise Sweden for their approach as well, but I think we have an inclusive and open dialogue with our youth delegates.
2 days ago, I talked actually to a person from civil society who called this whole COP in a way as a circus. And he was not referring to the negotiation when he was saying that, but really to everything that was taking place around the negotiation. So yeah, the civil society representation events like we are having here actually. Would you agree in a way, Carsten Sach, that maybe the outcomes of the negotiations would be more would be better in a sense when there wouldn't be this big circus, so to say, around the negotiation that maybe should become more the center of the COPs again?
I think circus is a disrespectful word because I was describing 4 functions of the COP earlier on, and being a global exposition for solutions and being a marketplace for exchange of best ideas, I think is important. Having said that, of course, I agree what Federica, I think, said it earlier on, is the question on who is represented in these solutions. And some argue, and I heard that in our discussion as well, that there are too many fossil fuel lobbyists around. Yes, that's true, and probably I would agree with this statement. On the other hand, you need to change these people, and they need to be exposed in an environment where most of us are striving for more rapid action. And therefore, I think it is important to have them on board as well, because I'm convinced that they go back impressed, because if they talk only amongst few lobbyists, then they just strengthen each other's view, and I think that would be wrong. So basically, the circus is part of the solution, even if I would call it differently.
All right, thank you, Carsten Sach. We are coming close to an end of this event, but before I would like to ask all of you for a closing remark, I at least briefly would touch upon the role of the US and ask you, Johan Rockstrom. We are here at the Nordic Pavilion at the moment, not far away from us here at COP26. There's also the US Pavilion, and they put a very strong message on the wall of their pavilion, namely that the United States is back in the Paris Agreement, back at COP, and ready to go all in on climate change. That sounds very ambitious, especially given the opposition President Joe Biden faces in his own country on the issue of climate change. So what is your assessment? Is the US promising, is the US meeting what they are promising here at COP26 with this message they have on the wall of their pavilion, or would you regard it a little bit more skeptical how much the US is really all in on climate change.
Yeah, thanks, and I'll come to that, but I really just have to connect with Karsten's point, because I so strongly agree with Karsten that never underestimate what's happening in the turbulent circus dynamics of these COP meetings. I can tell you that COP26, I haven't counted, but I've heard it from many sources so far, that never before has so many CEOs spent so many days at a climate COP. And that is in itself a tipping point. You know, never underestimate getting all these actors together, and every voice matters. And I totally agree with Fredrika that we are lacking so many strong voices. But just the messiness of this COP is in itself part of the kind of momentum in the right direction. And you could argue that what's happening outside of the closing of the rule book is potentially what is the most important elements of the COP26 coming out. And what's happened on the streets will be fundamental, because it will be just impossible for leaders, political leaders, to just walk away from this, because they will be held accountable, because never before have we had such strong criticism on trust and the need for accountability. So I think that's key. My only point to you on the US banner, yes, I fully stand behind this. I've had the privilege of having many informal discussions with John Kerry during the last 78 hours, the climate envoy of the United States. US is back in force. US is spending tremendous amount of time in dialogues with China. I would like to see post-Glasgow what Ottmar Edenhofer, my co-director here at Potsdam Institute, and myself call the G3 for climate, the three largest economic regions, the US, the European Union, and China, to really join forces in implementing everything out of Glasgow, to really show the momentum and connecting this in a climate justice context and support for developing country transitions. And I think we're seeing the emergent elements of this, not least because of the US-China agreement. I agree, it's a very fluffy text, but it's at least shows that there is a constructive attitude, and we haven't seen that consistently in the past.
Thank you, Johan Rockstrom. I would now like to come to the end of the event and close with giving each one of you the floor for a closing remark. With slightly differing but sometimes close questions, but I would start with you, Jule. And I would like to ask you, why do you think it is important that everything that happens here at COP is reported back to the people on the street, to the people in Germany, in Sweden, everywhere on the world? Why is it important to translate what's happening here at COP to the everyday life and everyday language of peoples?
I think it is like Fredrika already said, this is the only climate conference we have, and we are negotiating about our future, and this future is not, I would not say about the future, about what's happening in the next years, because we are already in the climate crisis. And for me as a journalist, I really learned in the last days especially, that many people do not really understand what is happening here. And it's a bit like in Brussels, many people do not know what's really happening in the European Parliament. And I think this is one task I will get with me when I'm going back to Germany in the next days, and I'm going to work on as a journalist, because I think it's really structural, everything here, but it's really important for our future, and many people think it's too abstract. And for example, in the German media, there's so much about Corona at the moment, and really little about the COP, and I think that has to change in the future.
Thank you very much for participating in this event, Jule. Carsten, my final question to you would be, what do you believe will be the most important issues to be discussed at the next COP, COP27, that will take place in Egypt next year, as it was announced yesterday. Will we still talk about Article 6, about climate finance, or do you see any new issues emerging? Maybe also any new initiatives by countries like Germany, Sweden, or the US, for example?
We need to talk about further ambition and better implementation towards reaching 1.5 or staying below 1.5. So we need a process and we need a ministerial roundtable on that at COP27. Secondly, we hope that we get a clear process for operationalizing the global adaptation goal, and therefore Egypt will have to play an important role. Thirdly, also further, hopefully we will have the opportunity to say that we have reached the famous $100 billion. So it's a goal, it's the solidarity aspect. And the last one is on cooperation, and that includes loss and damage. So it will be the same topics, but much more focused on implementation than on stating commitments.
Thank you, Carsten Sach. Frederica.
Actually, sorry, because I'm overrunning already.
All right.
Sorry, and thank you for having been invited for this fabulous event, and thanks to my co-panelists.
Thank you very much indeed on behalf of the organizers for participating in this event and for staying the whole time. Thank you and have a good day. Frederica, to come back to the overarching question of our event, would you say COP26 is a milestone for combating climate change?
I think it has to be, and I think that is up to the political leaders sitting there in the negotiation rooms right now to make sure that it is. I think either way, it's going to be a milestone, either for the milestone where we met the Paris Agreement and actually took the decisions that are needed, that we kept 1.5 alive, or it's the milestone where the public lost a lot of trust in the process. So that is really in the hands of negotiators. But I also think that regardless of the outcome of COP26, it is so crucial and important that everybody of us who are here in Glasgow or listening to this event or caring about the climate, that we carry that responsibility with us to continue to push our governments at home in our cities, in our where we live, and in our countries, to make sure that we actually get that future that we want and long for, one that is fossil-free and in line with nature.
Thank you, Frederica. Johan Rockstrom, already in the beginning of this event, you lined out that the current commitment by countries are not sufficient yet to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. What are the top 2 or 3 key priorities you believe that should happen here in Glasgow in the last hours of negotiations and discussions to at least come a little bit closer to reaching or to keeping 1.5 within reach?
Yes, I very much support, if you haven't read it, Fiona Harvey's article in The Guardian yesterday, where she concludes that perhaps the most important sentence in the Glasgow decision is the 30th paragraph, saying that 2022 there has to be another update of all the NDCs, meaning next year in Cairo. So we cannot go on this 5-year cycle, we have to have an annual cycle. And I think that is very reassuring, because again, we cannot declare success in Glasgow, we cannot declare failure in Glasgow, because we have enough momentum to see that things are moving, but it doesn't add up. So supporting everything that has been achieved here, and then having another checkup in Cairo in 12 years' time, really locked into the agreement, I think will be the most important outcome here. And that goes, by the way, also with the finance for both adaptation, loss and damage, and the investments in the Green Climate Fund.
Thank you, Johan Rockstrom. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Frederica again. Thank you, Jule again, for participating in this event. I think we have heard a lot about the negotiations today. We have realized once again they are complex, they are difficult, there are issues that are still on the tables there where we need solutions today. But there also has been progress, and I think what has become clear, at least to myself today during this discussion, is it is important to have this conference. It is important to have these international negotiations to bring together different opinions and look for common international solutions to climate change. I would like to thank everyone in the audience, and particularly express my gratitude again to the Nordic Council of Ministers and the staff here at the Nordic Pavilion who made this event possible, also to the translators who translated the live stream of this event to German language. So thank you very much, and best regards from Glasgow to wherever you are.